So now that we know what the scientific method is, we're going to talk about different types of methods of research. So the first thing we need to know is what is an operational definition. So an operational definition is a description of a property in concrete measurable terms. In other words, it defines a variable in terms of a specific procedure used to produce it. So an example is, say you want to measure, if someone prefers, cake to pie. How are you going to measure that? Okay, so that's what an operational definition is going to do, is it's going to tell you exactly how it's going to measure that. Another one would be, say you want to measure that by, you're going to show them pictures of different types of pie and cake, and then you're going to measure how much someone salivates by looking at the pictures. Okay, so your operational definition then would be exactly how you're going to measure the amount of saliva produced. So it could be, say, the number of milligrams of saliva absorbed by the cotton ball placed in a particular area of the mouth while looking at a picture for 10 seconds. Okay, so it's very detailed description of exactly how you're going to measure something. So after you have your question, you form a hypothesis, and then from your hypothesis, you have to decide how you're going to test that. And one of the ways of figuring out how you're going to test something is figuring out how you're going to measure it. So an operational definition is very important for all types of research methods. So just keep that in mind. Remember, you're going to need that for really any type of thing. And we're going to be talking about them later on as well. So now let's get into the types of research studies. So the first type of study we're going to talk about is called descriptive research. And so descriptive research is kind of a broad term that covers different types of studies. And really all it's doing is it's describing behavior. So you're not manipulating anything, you're not touching anything, you're just describing the behavior. So different types of this would be, say, a case study, some surveys, or naturalistic observations. So case studies in particular are a type of study where you only have a single individual. So we call that an N of 1. And so a lot of psychology then in case studies, then what we're doing is we're observing the behavior or changes in behavior of an individual that usually has gone through some kind of trauma. So a really interesting case is Phineas Gage. He's the guy pictured on the side, and he was a railroad worker, and he was working on the railroads one day when there was an explosion, and a metal pipe went through his head, through his left eye, right eye? One of his eyes, up through his head, and it pierced all the way through the skull. So you can actually see his skull on the right side there, and actually the pipe that went through him too on that bottom right-hand picture. So pretty big pipe, and surprisingly, he survived. He was able to live pretty old, but what they did see was a change in behavior. So that's a case study where you have an N of 1, because obviously we don't want to reproduce that, and they were able to study how his behavior changed. Another very famous case study is a guy called H.M. H.M., then he had epilepsy, And in order to try to fix it, then the doctors did a brain surgery. They removed part of his brain. And then afterwards, he was no longer able to create any new memories. So that was a great case study for scientists to kind of understand what part of the brain is involved in memory. Because in humans, you don't usually get to see how removing part of the brain affects behavior, but case studies really lets us study these things in kind of a non-invasive way. So the second type of descriptive research is, say, a survey. So survey research. And so what a survey is really sampling the population. So you're just talking to a small subset of the population. You're asking them questions, and then based on their responses, scientists will then extrapolate that data to generalize to the rest of the population. And the key thing with survey research and really any type of research is you're going to want to try to get what we call a representative sample. In other words, if the population is 50% male, 50% female, you want your sample to also be 50-50. If the population is 20% male and 80% female, then again, you want your sample to follow that. So that's a really key thing, because if you don't get a representative sample, then your conclusions you draw from just your survey will not properly represent the entire population. And then the next one we're going to talk about is naturalistic observation. So naturalistic observation is kind of just people watching. You're pretty much just observing people in their natural environment when they do not know that they're being observed. So again, it's just people watching. Scientists will sometimes just go to a mall, sit on a bench, and look at people, and they can draw conclusions of what's happening. Or you can think of this as candid cameras type of thing. So people don't know that they're being observed, and that way you can avoid them changing their behavior. So you get a true representation of how people react to certain things in a natural setting. Now, one thing that you really want to remember is that people will change their behavior when they know they're being watched. So TV shows like The Bachelor or Big Brother is not naturalistic observation. People know that they're being filmed and being watched when they're on these reality shows, so they're going to actually change their behavior. They're going to act differently. But if you're just walking around a mall, there are surveillance tapes around, but we're so used to it that we don't change our behavior usually. Some people do. I know when I was young, I loved to look at them and wave at the surveillance tapes. So obviously that's not naturalistic observation then. So that's something you want to keep in mind. And also keep in mind that naturalistic observation is not just in psychology, but especially in biology as well, because you can use naturalistic observation on animals in their natural habitats. And again, being at a zoo, not their natural habitat, so not really naturalistic observation. There are, of course, some limits to naturalistic observation. The first is that the experimenter can't inform the person that they're being observed. So sometimes that's a question of consent. And then it can be pretty difficult to study a lot of things with naturalistic observation because if you have a specific question in mind, then you can't always manipulate things naturally so that people don't know things are being manipulated, obviously. People are going to catch on. So you can't answer all questions, all scientific questions with naturalistic observation. Also, in order to get quality data from naturalistic observation, you actually have to observe for a long period of time multiple individuals just to get the desired behavior. So you'll spend a lot of time sitting on a bench looking, and nobody will be doing the behavior you want. So you just have to sit there kind of twiddling your thumbs, waiting for someone to do the behavior you want. So it is very time consuming. The second type of studies we're going to talk about are correlation research. So correlation is looking for relationships between variables. And the key word here is relationship. So correlational studies are looking at, are these two variables related? A key thing here is we're looking at what is the relationship between A and B. We are not, N-O-T, not, looking at does A cause B. Okay, so correlation is a relationship, not causation. This is a big one. I'm going to drive this home so much. And, you know, if on the test you say anything like, oh, well, A causes that or B causes whatever, that's a 0. Correlation is not causation. So, now that we've got that under the way, what you're really looking at is a pattern of variation between a series of measurements. So, on this table here on the right side, we have some participants, and then we've got, say, a treatment and a response. So this is all hypothetical data. Someone just made this up. And the hypothetical data is looking at the relationship between insults and favors. So treatment is, you know, were they insulted or were they not? And then the response is whether someone will do a favor for someone or not. Okay? So when it says insulted, that means obviously the researcher insulted the participant. The response is then the same researcher asked them, hey, will you do me a favor? In orange, it means they said no. And so what we're looking at here is that whenever someone was insulted, they also refused to do a favor. Okay, so that's a very big causation. Okay, so we're looking at the relationship. So when someone's insulted, they refused to do a favor. So this is a strong correlation. And we call this a strong manipulation because it's pretty much every time. Okay, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But the key thing with correlation is that you're measuring behavior. You're not manipulating behavior, you're just measuring it. Okay, so it's similar to that naturalistic observation, except instead of just describing the behavior, you're actually measuring it. So there are different types of correlation. And so we categorize them as, say, like a perfect correlation, a positive correlation, or a negative correlation. And this is really just looking at that relationship between the two variables. So a perfect correlation, we'll sometimes call this an R of 1, and that just means every time A happens, B happens. A happens, B happens. So every single time. So in that last slide, this would be a perfect correlation because every time they were insulted, they refused. Every time they were not insulted, they agreed. There's no instance of an insulted and agreed, right? So this would be a perfect correlation. A positive correlation now is when one variable increases, the other variable also increases. Now, this could also be as one variable decreases, the other one also decreases. In other words, as one variable changes, the other variable changes in the same way. This could be the more times you laugh at my jokes, the happier I feel. So if we look at this graph on the right side, you can imagine, say on the x-axis down here, we have the number of times you guys laugh at my jokes. And you can see as that increases to 100% of the time. And then on the y-axis here is the happier I feel. So as you laugh at my jokes, my happiness also increases. So we get this nice look right here. It's pretty linear if you think back to math class. And so this is what a positive correlation will look like. Now, opposite of that is a negative correlation. And so that means as one increases, the other decreases. So the two variables are acting differently. So again, if we look at the graph, you can see how it's different now. How instead of going upwards, it's going downward. And so if on the x-axis we say the faster you drive, so on the x-axis, let's say that's kilometers an hour. And then on the y-axis, then that could be the amount of time it takes you to get somewhere. So if you're going 20 kilometers an hour, it's going to take you 100 minutes to get somewhere, say, for example. Whereas if you go 80 kilometers an hour, it's only going to take you, well, this graph isn't great because it's saying -10. So pretty quick, you're going to get there. So you can kind of think of it like that. So as one increases, the other decreases. So when we measure the strength of a correlation, what we're doing is we're just kind of describing how positive or how negative a correlation is. And we use the letter R to tell us that. So again, it indicates the relationship between the two variables. And this is between a range of -1 and +1. So a -1 would be a perfect negative correlation, which means every time one increases, the other one decreases. So absolutely perfect. Whereas an R, a +1, would be a perfect positive correlation. So that's like that example we talked about earlier, where every time someone was insulted, they refuse to do a favor. Okay? So then we've got this 0 right in the middle. And so you're probably asking, well, what is 0? If it's not negative and it's not positive, what we call an R of 0 is no correlation. In other words, there's no relationship between the two variables. So those two variables could be, let me think. Let's call this variable A could be someone's favorite number, and variable B could be someone's height. Okay, so your favorite number does not represent your height, right? So someone whose favorite number is 2, there could be 2 different people where one person's 6 foot, the other person's 4'9". There's no relationship between your favorite number and your height. Okay, so that would be an example of R equals 0. So this R number, we'll call that the correlation coefficient. So we're going to stop here and we'll pick up on this on Wednesday.